Hello and welcome to part one of the AS History Topic Guide, and this one's going to be on Tsarist Russia. In this exact episode, we're going to be talking about 1855 to 1881, and this is the period of reign for Alexander II. In order to do this, though, you're going to need a bit of background knowledge on the Tsar and the state of Russia itself. So, in 1855, Russia was a hugely undeveloped country compared to the Western nations, with a ratio of village to town dwellers of about 11:1. Around 85% of the population were illiterate peasants, known as serfs back in the day, because in a feudal system we have, at the very bottom of the pyramid, we have slaves, then we go to serfs, then we go to peasants, then we go to above that like merchants and knights and so on and so forth. These serfs were treated with brutality really by their owners, because they could be owned because they were only one step up from being slaves, but actually had some form of right, even though not much at all. And these serfs lived in mirs, which were kind of communes where village elders regulated their primitive strip farming. They paid their master for land in rent, or in some cases labour, so they'd work for them, produce food for them, and that would be their payment. And they could be bought, sold and beaten by the elders. The leader of Russia at the time was an autocratic ruler called the Tsar, who not only ruled the country but was the head of the Orthodox Church of Russia at the time. And in 1855, Alexander II became the Tsar and continued the Romanov dynasty, which had been going for a few years now. At the time of Alexander's reign, there had been a massive war called the Crimean War, which had been going on for 1853, so it started 2 years before he came to power. Before he got to power as well, they'd just got to the disastrous part of the war where they'd been fighting the British, French and Turkish there, and had suffered several defeats, including the battles of Balaclava and Inkerman in 1854. In 1855, however, they lost Sebastopol, which was a huge major naval base for them, which kind of sensed the end of the war and brought a sense of loss and gradual defeat. Their final defeat was in 1855, just a year after Alexander took over, and the whole conflict highlighted how backwards Russia was, as their army was made up of serfs due to conscription. The conscription that they had meant that these serfs had to serve for 25 years in total, and they weren't allowed to leave the army. However, it showed the war as general showed that there was a huge lack of railway and outdated weaponry. And despite spending 45% of annual expenditure on the army, Russia still suffered from incompetent officers, humiliation, and an increase in serf uprisings afterwards. After the war, Alexander realised that something had to change, as Russia was desperately backward compared to the rest of Europe. To do this, he realised that the serfs were the issue, because the serfs weren't trained, they weren't healthy, they weren't really smart enough for anything to do with military knowledge, so they could win the war. He realised this is why they lost, and there was three main reasons for why, apart from the one that I just stated, that he decided to emancipate the serfs. There was a massive political motive, with the nobles relying on the Tsar and vice versa for the Tsar and the nobles. For the Tsar, he needed the nobles' backing and kind of support to be able to run the country, but the nobles needed serfs. But these serfs ended up in debt because a growing population of serfs and an inadequate agriculture system meant that money was being lost on the whole at the time, due to the fact that these nobles traditionally shunned business and relied on serfs to make money out of their estates. And it meant that many of these nobles had been forced to mortgage their land and even mortgage serfs as security for loans. And the fact that they could even loan out serfs and kind of mortgage serfs shows that how devalued they were in Russia at the time, and society wasn't what it would be in Europe at the time. So, and even the younger nobles that had kind of grown up in this system saw that it wasn't really working, and it was come to the very end and it was kind of struggling along, so they become critical of the regime, which of course isn't good for the Tsar because he wants everyone on board with what he's doing, especially during an autocracy. And he also had a big economic motive for this. Serfdom kept serfs tied to the land, making them unable to move to work in town or factories, or just keeping the internal demand for goods low. The traditional practices of the mir prevented experimentation with new agricultural methods, and this led to poverty and left many serfs unable to pay their taxes. This meant by 1859 the state faced a debt of 45 million rubles altogether, which is a drastically large amount. However, there was a small moral and intellectual motive behind this change. People who didn't want Russia to remain as backwards as they were and move towards the examples that France and Britain had set during like the French Revolution and just Britain in general and how powerful our empire was, wanted Russia to move towards the European kind of example and abandon serfdom, while Slavophiles favoured reforming serfdom but wanted to keep a traditional peasant society like had always been the case. Slavophiles being people who want to keep Russia backwards and they believe that their country is the best the way it is and kind of full support of the Tsar in the church and nothing needs to change kind of people. The emancipation itself came with a lot of reforms. On the left hand side of my table we have the actual reforms themselves. On the right hand side we have the evaluation, so we're just going to go through the actual terms. Serfs were declared free and given rights, which is a kind of a massive thing for the serfs back in the day, as it meant that they could marry who they chose, own property, set up businesses, travel, enjoy legal rights. They were also given their own cottage and allotment of land, which is a big upgrade since some of them might not even have had land at their disposal at any time because they worked for the Tsar, they worked for the nobles, and therefore probably just worked on the land and only got given like a small section to go and grow vegetables in or something like that. Valuation: peasants could now buy up the land, increase output, and make money from the sales of surplus grain. So it meant that they kind of moving towards more capitalist properties due to the fact that serfs could now make money for themselves, not rely on the nobles, and make a living for themselves. Those prepared to sell land could move to cities for jobs. In theory, they were now free and not tied to the land. However, land allocations varied, with the nobles kind of distributing land how they wanted and not kind of letting the peasants choose what land they want. The peasants' freedom and rights are theoretical, as they couldn't move with the redemption payments. This is the biggest issue with emancipation, because some historians kind of argue that it's not even emancipation itself. It's more of kind of like a change of name for the serfs, really. The only thing that really changes is the fact that they're not referred to serfs anymore but peasants. This is because they were still tied to the land, as we'll see later on with redemption payments, but it just meant that it was a theoretical kind of like social change rather than a actual affecting them. Another term was that landlords were granted government bonds as compensation. Landowners could now use that compensation to redeem debts. Some of these landlords could only just about pay off debts and forced sell land due to the fact they relied on the serfs so heavily and not actual business themselves. So it made a lot of landlords and nobility dislike the Tsar and the regime that he'd set forward, and kind of brought up a new kind of wave of criticism for the Tsar that he hadn't ever faced before and Russia hadn't faced before. This was one of the big major issues for emancipation. This term of the edict was that serfs were required to make 49 annual redemption payments for the land they were given. 49 being a massive amount of years for back in the day, since the life expectancy was about 30 for Russia. So these redemption payments would last about one generation and a half, if that, depending on kind of situation of that family. So it meant that their debt was passed down onto their kids. So not only were they tied to the land, but their kids were also tied to the land. However, redemption payments provoked unrest, as you could probably guess, they would with the serfs, due to the fact that now they are free, they have debt though, so financially they're chained to the land. Whether or not they are socially free is a different circumstance. Some peasants now had to work for their old masters just to survive, and the purchasing power of peasants remained very low, due to the fact that they wouldn't have any money at all, due to the fact that they have to kind of finance all their money into the redemption payments. It meant that realistically, just financially, just not a great place for any of the serfs at all, due to the fact that all their kind of profits for food is going straight back into the government's pocket instead of just the nobility. The mayor was responsible for collecting taxes and redemption fees, and freed serfs had to stay in the mayor till redemption payments were complete. This basically just sums up the above, due to the fact that mayors prevented serfs from leaving the countryside due to the economic chains that were placed on them. And however, the issue was that mayors promoted restricted and backwards farming. There was no innovative ideas. It meant that if the serfs were struggling with harvest due to the harsh conditions of Russia, then they were kind of screwed by themselves, really. Like, there was no chance of them surviving at all. What came with the edict was the fact that landowners were allowed to retain personal land. The term personal land basically just means whatever they deem as fit for themselves. And a massive issue with this is that the fact that the serfs lost their landlord's protection, due to the fact that the nobility, when they owned peasants, it meant that the peasants were their property, so therefore they were able to defend them, kind of stick up for them against other nobility, other serfs. But now they were kind of on their own, free, independent, and without protection. Also, with this, even though they were emancipated, the labour service remained for a 2-year period of temporary obligation, which basically means they were forced to do so for 2 years, whether that be work for the Tsar himself under his rule, or just work for the local nobility. It meant that for these 49 annual redemption payments, they would struggle very, very badly, due to the fact that now they were trying to finance enough money to even just survive with these redemption payments, never mind kind of produce food for themselves. This took a lot of time away from them and meant that a lot of them ended up struggling. As you can probably guess, the peasants were very, very resentful of this. However, not resentful towards the Tsar, but the nobility themselves. So we have the nobles kind of angered at the Tsar, and the peasants angered at the nobility. So it kind of downwards in the chain of command, they blamed the person above them. And they had 647 riots in 4 months, which is a crazy amount of numbers. So that's about 175 per month, which is something like 4 a day, if that more than 4 a day, which is hard to believe. He also did a lot more kind of reforms at the time. He changed a lot of different things. He had a lot of reason for these further reforms. 2 major ones. There was disappointment at the end of the emancipation, on both part of the peasants and landlords, which continued unrest in the countryside. The emancipation as well left issues needing resolution, e.g. conscription and control of local government and justice, due to the fact that no one stood up for them anymore. This was the judicial changes that allowed them to kind of be represented, and now kind of stood up for and introduced a new form of crime and law and order. So in 1864, the Tsar made some judicial changes, which are arguably the most influential ones that he ended up making, because they kind of came into balance with Alexander III and kind of open the eyes of society of what could actually be done. So this reform established a single system of courts, like the European system was at the time. Criminal cases were now before a jury, which was exactly what the European standard was. Instead of just having one judge deciding the fate of someone who was usually corrupt and working on behalf of the Tsar, all classes were judged equal before the law, so nobility and peasants were on equal footing when they came into the courts, rather than beforehand peasants would have probably just been accused of, say, whatever, stealing. They would have been instantly declared guilty, whereas even if there was evidence against the nobles, they would probably go free unpunished due to the fact that the Tsar needed their support. For the first time ever, proceedings were open to the press. This meant that people could now go in and kind of have a look at how justice was working, how justice should be, and how it compared to the West. It meant that also kind of when it came to writing opposition protocol and like propaganda, it meant that people had something to base it off, which was quite important for the future due to the fact they're going to open the eyes of society. And judges' training and pay improved due to the fact that they don't want them to be bribed, they don't want them to be corrupt. Alexander decided that this was a necessary step to achieving a good, orderly law and order system. The successes of this reform meant that judges were now fairer and less corrupt, and now, not for the Tsar, but the jury could undermine the government, which highlights how free society could have been if these reforms carried on doing, as these juries were giving results that maybe the Tsar probably wouldn't be wanting to be out there. Like if someone had committed a terrorist attack against someone that had been terrorizing their local area, the peasants were more likely to declare the person innocent for committing a killing, even though they knew he was guilty. So it's a bit of a win-win for society, because it meant that they can give perverse kind of assessments and also like represent their country, which is something that most of them had never done before. However, weaknesses is that military courts still continued, where they could just kind of court-martial you on the spot and kind of execute you if they believe that you are committing treason or any of the above. And also, it didn't apply in Poland, which is an interesting weakness for that as well. The local government reforms equally is influential, with the Zemstva being established in 1864. This was basically the first governing body that Russia had ever had to represent the people. If you're comparing it to British standards, it's basically the local councils that they'd have had. So people were represented and elected through a voting system. However, these votes weren't equal for classes. So basically, you'd have a serf's vote equaling one. Kind of like, if you put it into numbers, you'd have one vote, one peasant, that's what they'd get. But one nobility equals 100 votes. So they were kind of not rigged, but vastly unjust in how they were performed. The Zemstva, however, were given power to improve public services, which was a massive plus for Russia at the time, as it showed that the Tsar cared and kind of achieved his nickname of Father Tsar that they gave him. The successes of this was that the Zemstva provided a local representation, which had never been done before. They made significant improvements to society and also provided a forum for debate. This one, if it doesn't seem major, it's probably just because it's just a debate, like who cares? But the thing is, debates back in Russia were the most unheard of due to the fact that before Alexander, criticism to the regime would have just ended with execution, would have ended in kind of like just being outcast and shunned from society. But now the fact that you can argue and kind of criticise what is happening is a massive forward step for Russia, and kind of you see over the course how with censorship and how it's been lifted, and kind of and then put back down. It shows that it's kind of like almost like a kettle, really, like with the steam in there. First, kind of boil it a little bit, so the steam in there, but you keep on boiling and boiling it, and then lifting the lid on and off and on and off, and keeping it down for a long amount of time. When you finally lift it off, all the steam's going to come up at once. So, yeah, that's how it works. I was referring to a saucepan, not a kettle, sorry. But yes, that is basically what was happening with Russia at the time, due to the fact that it was kind of like political pressure building and then kind of being lifted and closed throughout the whole course, and this is where it originally started. However, a weakness of the local government reforms was that they were dominated by nobles and professionals, as was stated with the one peasant vote to 100. And for some reason, they didn't have any control over taxation and law and order, due to the fact that that was the job of the police force at the time. And they were very, very kind of violent and forceful in the way that they were going about doing this, and it wasn't really the method that you'd like to see in society, due to the fact that it wasn't really working, and it kind of brought a wave of fear rather than kind of trust that he wanted to. The police force at the time was the third section, later replaced by many names. You'll hear like the Akrama, Cheka, NKVD, kind of a lot of different ones, but the one under Alexander II was called the third section, and they were in charge of taxation, law and order, and kind of just implementing what the Tsar wanted. The military reforms in 1874. These ones were kind of big for Russia at the time, due to the embarrassment of the Crimea. He wanted to change how the military was run. So kind of an embarrassment like that wouldn't ever happen again. Conscription was now made compulsory for all, which for over 20-year-olds, due to the fact that the age limit was lower at the time of the Crimean War, now being lifted up a little bit to get more experience and kind of more competent soldiers. The length of service was reduced from 25 to 15 years, which meant that you wouldn't have to be in the army for 25 years, and that would usually be like the whole lifespan of some of the peasants back in the day, due to the fact of life expectancy back then. And 9 of those years were spent in reserve, so you could live your normal life, go off farm, but still be a part of the army in the reserve, just in case any war kicked off. There were vast welfare improvements during the time, which meant that like the abolition of corporal punishment and army service was no longer given as punishment. So it just meant that they were more lenient in the army, and kind of tolerant of serfs. Military colleges were now established, which kind of like increased the education of the country, due to the fact that 85% of them were illiterate serfs. Now to try and raise this kind of education system through the use of the army, and also modern weaponry was introduced, which was kind of a highlight of the Crimean loss as well, due to the fact that French, Turkish and English weaponry was a lot better than that of the Russians. The successes of this was that a smaller but better army was created. They were more trained, they had better equipment, and this was all due to the fact that the cost of military was reduced because there's less mouths to feed, because there's a smaller army, and also literacy was improved. However, on the other hand, officers were still mainly aristocrats. No experience of war, no anything, just the fact that they're nobility and able to kind of boss around these peasants made it still an inefficient army in total. You could see how inefficient this army was, because the war against Turkey took very long, and then later on, under Nicholas, they lost against Japan, which was the first ever European nation to lose a warfare battle against the East. Well, in the 18th century, the 19th century, anyways, and just before that, not including the Crimea, or, I mean the Crusades or anything like that. But naval battle and kind of land battle, it was embarrassing for them. Now, alongside that, educational reforms were put in place. Um, Alexander realised that improving education was the key to modernisation, and a man called Golovin led these radical reforms. The main kind of reforms were that the Zemstva now took control of primary education instead of the church. Free primary education was kind of promoted for all. Vocational secondary schools were set up now, kind of like how we did back in Britain before they were changed. So there'd be like technical colleges where they'd be kind of promoting skills like wood cutting, engineering, that kind of thing, if you think about it these days. And a kind of added feature to this was that both secondary schools could now progress to university. So it meant that if you go to kind of do these kind of hands-on courses, it still meant that you could progress to university, which was a big plus for them. And universities were now made self-governing instead of run by the church, which was a massive kind of plus for the universities, as they could teach what they wanted to teach, how they saw fit. And it also kind of gave like an opening up to kind of more critical thinking subjects instead of like ones that the church would easily dismiss. The successes of this reform from 1856 to 1880 was that the number of primary schools tripled. And therefore, alongside that, the number of children in primary education more than doubled. So this is going along with the trying to reduce the 85% of illiterate people in Russia at the time. With this primary school education, there's going to be a lower illiterate rate, which is kind of great for the education of the country. And later on, there was now a greater selection of subjects, usually more critical thinking one, and also the number of students at uni tripled. Well, this is probably due to the fact that primary schools tripled, students at unis tripled. It's kind of like a direct correlation. However, weaknesses of this was that the primary curriculum was based on religion. So even though the Zemstva took control of it, it still meant the church still kind of implemented their own way to kind of teach the children, because that's the only way that teachers have ever taught before. However, even though primary education was free, secondary schools were still fee paying, so not everyone could afford to go there. And especially with universities, more radical students joined opposition groups due to the fact that they were now learning about critical thinking subjects. They now kind of got their own opinions for themselves instead of being taught everything that they need to know, kind of like more of a free will and kind of knowing what they should be knowing. For the first time ever in Russian history, there was kind of a big emergence of opposition. Alexander's reforms in the 1860s allowed opposition to emerge. Due to the fact there was relaxation of censorship, it allowed critical books to spread. With one of the most influential books in history being allowed to spread under this period, due to the fact that they managed to get Marx's Das Kapital, which we'll be talking about a little bit later, to get through and translated, which was devastating for the Tsarist regime. Educational changes led to the growth of radical organisations, such as the kind of being taught different things at university, and kind of critical thinking kind of groups allowed these youth to have more of a say in what was going on. Legal reforms promoted legal careers and people who were critical of the government. This meant that with the judiciary, kind of it promoted people to become judges and kind of opened people up to being, with these special cases, being kind of critical of what was happening in Russia at the time. Two main opposition groups that were kind of formed on the back of education were a group called Young Russia, who were a student organisation which were hostile to both the Tsar and the church. This group was responsible for a series of fires in St. Petersburg in 1862. In 1863, the organisation, which was set up by students at a Moscow university to coordinate the revolutionary activities. These were the two biggest groups at the time and the most influential at the time, due to the fact that they kind of caused publicity for opposition against the Tsar, which had never been done before. Following a few assassination attempts on the Tsar's life in 1866 and 1867. Alexander kind of adapted, and a period of reaction followed because due to the fact that he thought that people didn't like the regime due to the fact that they were trying to kill him and get rid of him. So he appointed 2 reactionary ministers in the people of Tolstoy and Shuvalov. Yeah, Shuvalov. That's what we're going to go with. And there were 2 main areas that he decided to kind of react on. Education and police and law with courts. The policies that he first did were that authority over primary schools were handed back to the church, and Zemster's actions were restricted. Subjects to encourage critical thinking were now removed that universities had on offer. Student organisations were banned due to the fact of the actions of the organisation and the other ones that were forming, such as Young Russia. University appointments could be vetoed by the government, which basically gave them control over university, even though universities were meant to be self-governing at this stage. And students from vocational studies and the vocational schools couldn't go to university anymore due to the fact that they were the kind of ones that were kind of more angered against the regime and wanted to see an end to it. The results of these reforms were that religious control was reasserted, the curriculum was restricted, female education strictly and steeply declined. Many students escaped restrictions by studying abroad, though. This is what many of the critical thinking people of the time did by going abroad, seeing what kind of Europe was like at the time, such as people like Lenin and Marx, but students also did the same by going abroad and studying in Europe. With the police, law and courts, the work of the third section, the police force at the time, was increased. In 1878, political crimes were tried in secret in military courts once again, and governor-generals were given emergency powers to use military courts and impose exile, which is kind of a massive reform on the Western system, because that wasn't in place in Europe until maybe World War One or two, where emergency kind of measures were put in place. But in a time of non-emergency, these were the kind of reforms that were put in place for Russia. The results of this was that critics and opponents thrived underground, and it kind of made it more tempting to join them because it felt like it was like illegal, and kind of people who were against the regime were more tempted to go and join them. Show trials were abandoned due to sympathetic juries. This was due to the fact that people would have the people would have made perverse decisions against people and against the Tsarist regime itself. And a little bit of extra research would be Vera Sulovich, who was given a massively perverse acquisition due to the fact that she killed a member of the government, but then kind of went back in court and said she was guilty, and the jury still said that she was innocent. However, the Tsar had a change of heart, it appears, due to the fact of the Russo-Turkish War from 1877 to 78, which explains some of the judicial changes were made with the kind of military courts, and the famine of 1879 to 80, the beginning of an industrial recession and further assassination attempts led to the Tsar to establish a commission to investigate revolutionary activity. This led to the release of political prisoners, which is kind of an issue for the Tsar because he wouldn't really want to do it in the best kind of time, but he was forced to due to opposition. He also relaxed censorship again, which, as I said, with the analogy of the saucepan with the lid, you can keep taking the lid on and off censorship, but now he put pressure back down. When he lifted it back up again, now more radical opposition propaganda was spreading, such as the book of Das Kapital by Marx, which is one of the most influential books of all time. So realistically, if he was going to relax censorship, he should have kept it relaxed for the whole time, such as the Tsars after him. But he kept on being, throughout this period, being relaxed and kind of opened up again. And even in the time of Lenin and Stalin, this was kind of an issue. He also lifted the restrictions on the Zemstva. He removed the tax on salt. Salt back in the day was kind of a huge preservative due to the fact that they didn't have fridges and such forth. Even though Russia is as cold as it is, they still need to preserve food, so the removal of tax on salt made it a lot easier to preserve food, and during a famine that's exactly what you want. And he also led the abolition of the third section. However, it was replaced by the Akrama, of which Alexander III used, but the kind of organisation of the third section ceased to exist after Alexander was done with it. Two major opposition radical thinkers to Alexander II, Buchanan, yes, an anarchist and socialist, and he suggested a model of collective ownership of land. This was along the ideas of Marx, but he published a book called Catechism of Revolutionary, which promoted critics of the regime to be merciless in their pursuit of revolutionary change. This would have gone alongside kind of propaganda of the people's will that we'll look at later, but kind of a more radical and merciless pursuit to follow. He also translated Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto into Russian, and Marx's Das Kapital was published. Marx believed that society had evolved through struggles, and the final stage is a struggle between the proletariats and the bourgeoisie, and after a short dictatorship, a perfect society would emerge. Basically, the ideas of communism were now kind of around and surrounding Russia, and this was a major thing for the Tsar to kind of keep a lid on, but didn't end up in the end being able to, due to the fact it promoted a government system that was different to the one that was at hand, which was more favourable to the people and the workers at the time. Opposition from 1870 to 80 kind of varied. In 1874, the biggest opposition group to Russia's date at the time, called the Narodniks, also known as Populists, were formed, and 2,000 people, mainly students, went to Go to the People and started this campaign called Go to the People. This involved going to the countryside to get peasants to agree with their cause. However, due to the peasants' ignorance and kind of faith in the Tsar, and loyalty to the church as well, the peasants believed that the Narodniks were secret police agents, and it led peasants to reject them and sometimes even hand them over to the police. In this time, there were 1,600 arrests, and the group disbanded. In 1876, though, a second Narodnik movement was attempted, but also failed with many attempts. In 1877, the remaining Narodniks established Land and Liberty, which achieved two big things: assassinated General Mendeleev, who was head of the third section at the time, in 1878, and they also tried many attempts on the Tsar's life. Land and Liberty themselves, though, split into two major groups, one of which being the Black Partition, which was organised by Plekhanov, which aimed to partition the black soil, which kind of promised the peasants land and kind of provinces among the peasants. Their methods were that they would work peacefully among peasants, they would spread radical materials among students and workers. However, they were weakened by arrests, and in 1880 to 1881, they were broken up. The People's Will, on the other hand, were led by Mikhailov, and they were larger than the Black Partition. They advocated violent methods and assassinations, and actually succeeded in 1881 in assassinating Alexander the Tsar. at the time. The significance of this spread of opposition shows that the government failures at the time, due to the fact that the Tsar's regime lacked authority, even though the third section were kind of violent in their methods, it was nowhere near the kind of way that the Tsar needed to control the country at the time. Demands from reform from below had grown and spread socially. It was kind of more of a fear that the peasants would rise up against the Tsar, and kind of a belief in this for the first time in history had happened. Also, the nobilities who opposed Alexander's reforms forced him to adopt a more reactionary stance, and he kind of took a path of reaction and then kind of liberal reforms throughout the whole period, as you can see by the period of reaction. But on the day he was actually assassinated, he was going to make as later in Russian history, a Duma, but he was going to create government representation for the people, which had never been done before. Although Zemstvers were kind of new, this was more on a kind of national stage that they could be represented on. And unfortunately for Russian history, he was killed on the way there due to the fact that the People's Will had thrown a bomb at his carriage. It had blown up. The Tsar, being the Tsar father, went outside to check if anyone was okay. Someone was injured, and a second bomb was thrown at him, blowing off both his legs, and he later died in the Winter Palace in front of his family. Which sets us up really nicely for Alexander III, due to the fact that this was a major influence on him seeing his father die, and what Alexander was about to do before he died showed that Alexander III should take a more reactionary stance. However, that is it for today's podcast. Catch you for part 2 and Alexander III.